The story of Aesop Wilson is one that is both poignant and disturbing in equal measure. Imagine, if you will, a time when the body of a young man that had prematurely met his fate could be kept in a casket at the top of the stairs of an old house, with no one thinking very much about it. Here lies the central subject of this very strange vignette. Dr. Creed Taylor Wilson had come to Indiana to build a house that he literally had envisioned only in a dream. He laid the foundations of his home in Medora, where he hoped to set down roots and rear a family of which he could be proud. His wife, a devoted mother to her young son, was overjoyed at the move, and finally felt that the family move to this new, untrammeled territory was a chance to lay down the sorts of roots that stretch onward into the future for generations. The year of the move was 1848. The future of the country would soon be rocked by the bloody epoch of the Civil War, a catastrophic conflagration that would grab the best and hardiest of young Americans in its bloody embrace, sweeping them to an early, violent grave. Unfortunately for the Wilson family, they would not be spared the tragedy of this blistering episode in American history, as their young son, Aesop, was called into service. He quickly dispatched to a camp in Missouri, where he was a part of Indiana Volunteer Company B, 22nd Regiment. Unfortunately, perhaps, he was denied the consolation of a hero's death on the battlefield, contracting typhoid quite early in his service. His body was shipped back to his family, where a grieving mother seemed to become psychologically unhinged at the reality of losing her young son. She demanded the preservation of young Aesop's body in a lead coffin, which she likewise had placed in an upstairs hallway. It was here, month after month, she would sit rocking back and forth in her seat, cooing to the corpse of young Aesop and speaking to him as if he were merely resting in his fresh new casket. In fact, this bizarre situation seems to be the only recourse to be taken. Otherwise, theorized the husband, the woman might descend into a bottomless chasm of melancholy and mourn herself to death. Of course, the situation couldn't remain as it was. Bizarre happenings started to transpire in the home, as weird footsteps and strange knocks began to disturb the family and other visitors. Cold spots lingered, whispers could be heard barely audibly in the strange corners of the house when all was quiet. Mr. Wilson, though understanding the comforting effect of having the interred body of her son ever ready and at hand to speak with and comfort her, began to pressure Mrs. Wilson that finally something must be done. She would, at first, have none of it. After all, she had taken to spending her evenings hovering over the casket, talking to her baby, and doing her knitting. We could, perhaps, presume she was working on a burial blanket. However, the bizarre manifestations continued and even began to become increasingly worse, until it became quite apparent that some immediate action must be taken. Mr. Wilson finally decided to contact a spiritualist from Louisville, Kentucky, to come up and officiate at what would become a séance. Although history does not leave to us the identity of this august personage, we can well imagine what the situation must have looked like. The average sitting consisted of several persons sitting around a table in a dimly lit or darkened room holding hands. Often an old-fashioned séance could begin with a prayer or with the singing of a hymn, but soon the officiating medium would begin to be taken over by a unquote, or guardian spirit that would act as an intercessory between the sitters and whatever spirit they were attempting to contact. If, indeed, there was any particular spook they were endeavoring to call up, and usually there was. On the table often was a host of various odd assemblies, musical instruments, most often trumpets, and most especially items that could be considered to have been very important to the deceased spirit being contacted. Items like a pair of gloves, a lock of hair, a favorite trinket or brooch. Incidentally, some mediums well versed in the materialization, unquote, of entire spirit forms, ostensibly through the use of ectoplasm, a sort of gooey mess that at times projected itself from the mouth, ears, or nostrils of the medium, had recourse to a spirit cabinet, unquote, or a kind of wardrobe that could be entered by the spiritualist and from which the spirit form would soon emerge. Of course, the incredulous, such as the debunker Harry Houdini, could be forgiven for an amount of skepticism concerning the use of such trick cabinets. But the legitimate mediums did manage to produce a startling amount of truly inexplicable phenomenon. Levitation, strange scents, weird tappings and rapping, musical instruments seemingly playing themselves, and so on and so forth. In addition, there were the spirit voices that seemed to mimic perfectly the voices of the departed. Often these voices related information that could only be known to the grieving loved ones. Such seems to have been the case in the Wilson seance. The anonymous medium settled himself down at the table, perhaps enjoining the family to first say a prayer, calling on the highest of the high to come forth and make itself manifest. After a suitable interval, the medium just having begun to feel the cool presence of spirit enter the room, the temperature must have dropped perceptibly. Suddenly, his, quote, control, unquote, a red Indian, took possession of him, and to act as the, quote, go-between, unquote, between the spirit being summoned and the sitters. In this case, we can surmise, and history records, that the spirit of Aesop Wilson made himself manifest. The mouth of the medium may have been moving, uttering the words in trance, or the message may have been given through, quote, direct voice, unquote, i.e., the voice of Aesop Wilson might have come like a soft rustling whisper through the darkness, imploring, "Mother, bury me, for it is time for you to let go and move on, and it is time for me to go to quiet rest." Whatever exactly happened in that dark seance room, we can be sure of one thing. Aesop Wilson's request to be buried, like other men, was finally heeded, and the family henceforth experienced no more disturbances.